Elden Ring is a wake-up call. What kind of wake-up call? Not sure. Let's find out.
Elden Ring is a wake-up call. And no, I'm not talking about the players. This isn't a video about difficulty. Well, that does actually come up at some point in time in the
It should be, because the difficulty of the DLC and what people are saying about it is definitely very telling.
video. But Elden Ring does something incredibly unique, something very special, something that the rest of the upper echelon of the video game industry just can't seem to replicate. And that's come out with a holistic, high-quality title that delivers on the player's expectations for under $70, not once, but twice. Elden Ring isn't just a great game. It's a case study on what games should be or should strive to be. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, that seems kind of agreeable. Everyone likes Elden Ring, and when everyone likes something, that something is doing something right. But then again, let's be completely fair. Can we replicate that? I'm gonna probably say no. World of Warcraft Classic has been tried and tried and tried again to be replicated by many, many, many different games over the years, and yet everything fails. We technically know what it does, how it does it, and so on, but somehow everyone just magically fails to replicate the success of World of Warcraft Classic. And I think the answer to that is very simple why that happens, honestly. It's because we don't understand what we truly like. We can talk about level design being good, the color palette's nice, the combat feels good, and many other things. But at the end of the day, in our head, in our subconscious and whatnot, we do not understand why we like things and so on.
Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree hit a peak concurrent player count of over 780,000 players. I want to point out just how absurd it is that this is a DLC expansion that's widely a single-player game that not only hit that high of a concurrent player count, but that's over 80% retention from the game's peak of its initial release, which was 950,000 players.
Yeah. And one bigger thing, honestly, about this is the fact that the DLC is locked behind a boss that only 30% of the player base killed. That's insane. That also makes it even more insane.
Now, to add to this absurdity, the official Elden Ring Twitter account posted an image announcing over 5 million Tarnished have entered into the realm of shadows. We aren't even mentioning that according to Steam, at the time of this recording, only 40% of players have defeated Mohg to be even able to gain entrance.
Oh, now it's 40%. Previously, when this was announced and we found out that you need to kill a boss, and that's one of the end bosses, that only 30% of people initially finished it. Wow.
Into the DLC, with now both Elden Ring and its DLC claiming top spots in Steam's top sellers, and likely the same for each platform the game is now available on. It's safe to say that Elden Ring is a massive achievement, one that's not only worth appreciation, but study. However, it is my firm belief that the games industry leaders have no intention of paying attention because emulating the success of FromSoft and Miyazaki require humility, talent, and vision, all things seemingly bankrupt from many of today's modern games.
I'm not gonna lie, I honestly, the only thing I think you need is talent to make these games good, and, well, no studio has talent. Again, the thing I'm saying about Bethesda at this point, and, you know, Bethesda and Ubisoft effectively, is they have lost all the talent. There are no more talented people left. Everyone who's left there working, making games and whatnot, is a subpar hack.
Something that I think is really well represented when we start to look back at the most influential games over the past couple of years, Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3, where when we compare these two, they become eerily similar. You see a direct thread of unaccountable developers, distancing themselves from products that they know that they can't make themselves. If you don't remember, AAA developers from both Ubisoft and Guerrilla Games dogged on Elden Ring for getting a 97 on Metacritic and how it means that reviewers don't care about game's UI, another developer unimpressed with the graphic stability and performance, and another one, well, from Horizon talking about bad quest design.
The good bad quest design, that's hilarious. In a Souls-like game. A bad quest design, my dude. Have you not been really paying attention?
Now, in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, we had developers take a different approach. They used their imagination, realizing that they can't make players believe that, While something they enjoy is actually bad, they preemptively tried to distance themselves before the release of Baldur's Gate 3, painting the game as an incredibly unique set of circumstances, unable to be repeated, and an unfair standard for future games to be compared to. Calling the game rockstar level nonsense for scope, saying baseline.
By the way, I never talked about it, but this sentence, rockstar level of nonsense, is a completely nonsensical, word salad. Because think about it. Rockstar level nonsense means, GTA. Where they actually put in a goddamn billion for the newest release. Baldur's Gate 3 did not cost even close to $1 billion to be made. And yet it was made. Interesting how that happens.
And comparisons are a damaging thing to use, and my personal favorite from the Diablo 4 senior designer, Chris Baldur, saying, "But people too often look at the fruits of labor and not the labor itself. Same as it ever was, I guess. Same deal with people wondering why there are so few artists painting like Renaissance masters." Yes, Chris, we are wondering where the Renaissance masters were when you released Diablo 4, a 20-year-old franchise at this point that remained in turmoil for the better part of a year. Please.
Technically, it's Diablo 4 is only not in turmoil currently because there's no interest in it. Everyone has abandoned it at this point. No one has any interest. Season 4 completely killed the game, as I said, and now there's, gonna be maybe a spike. But effectively, this was the player base, then it got desperate, then it got real bad, and now that everything has settled, this is the player base, and it's the same situation effectively as Diablo 3. There are still probably like 10k people playing Diablo 4 daily, which is a pretty decent number overall or whatever, or maybe even more. But these are just the slop eaters, the dribble suckers, these kind of people. The people who played Diablo 3. Essentially that. Because Diablo 4 is currently copying every single mechanic that was ever introduced in Diablo 3 at a rocket pace.
Tell me more about how much time and experience matter when it comes to developing great games. By this measure, Ubisoft's open world games should be untouchable masterpieces by now with how many games that they've been making. The controversies surrounding both games prove a lack of vision and accountability. Jealous developers wishing that people talked about their games the way that they've been talking about Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3, but the biggest value that we received as players from this conversation was the transparent realization that these studios and developers genuinely do not understand the wants and needs of players, the same as our newfound kings in FromSoft and Larian. It's crazy. When you start to look back at some of these older conversations, you realize why the games industry is in the position it's in today. And you look at all these developers that are caught in the trap of thinking about things like high fidelity graphics and huge scope and overbloated UIs when all of those things are serving to do is increase their budgets and bleed their profits. No wonder these guys have low expectations for future projections of the industry. I wonder where that's coming from. The funny thing is that none of those things have anything to do with the reason why Baldur's Gate 3 or Elden Ring were successful games. 5 seconds of scrolling social media is going to show you why players like those games. And it's pretty simple. They're just good games. They're enjoyable. In Baldur's Gate 3's case, it was just the ability to genuinely have real choice in a video game. In Elden Ring, it's just a damn good game. And these opinions that these guys throw out there just go to show that they're not playing these games, and they're not playing these games with the eye of a player. They're playing it with the eye of somebody that's making their own game, and you need to change that perspective. You want to know how to make a game as successful and as...
People can't look in from the perspective of someone else. Surprising? Not really. Everyone knows that most people can do it. It's surprising. It's almost a surprisingly high talent nowadays. The idea that you can distance yourself from something and look at it from the perspective of someone else. It's almost like a talent. And, well, needless to say, yeah, there's a lot of greed in the gaming industry. There's a lot of, I want to be best, Diablo 4 is their best, and, best, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of that. It's happening, and these people, well, they only care about being the best, even if it's not true. So, when you can't be the best, what they typically do? Well, they try to pull everyone else down to their level. And that's what's happening.
Is as incredible as Elden Ring? Well, you have unyielding vision on what you believe players want to play, what you yourself want to play. And Miyazaki reveals that to us now. In a recent newsletter from The Guardian, Miyazaki gives his thoughts on game design and the current state of the video game industry. The Guardian writes, "The famously challenging dark fantasy epic Elden Ring was the world's second best-selling game in 2022. And the release of its expansion, Shadow of the Erdtree, last Friday, once again has everyone arguing about whether it's too difficult. Every single FromSoft developed game since 2009's Dark Souls has inspired this discourse, and I'm not going to get into it because it's neither interesting nor particularly consequential. These games are what they are, and you can either get on board or, quite justifiably, walk away." The vision is passed down from the game's director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, also president of FromSoft since 2014, having made his and the developer's name with Dark Souls in 2011. It's harsh, sure, but there's also an element of faith and encouragement in this approach to game design. Elden Ring and his other games trust that if you just persevere and call on other players for help, you'll triumph eventually, and it'll feel all the sweeter. Miyazaki is an interesting character and one of the most influential.
I wonder if people actually are like, wait, no, not agreeing with that, because Elden Ring is supposed to be a hard game, and, well, obviously Miyazaki thought it was not hard enough when they released it, so the expansion was harder, and that's the point of this game. Try, succeed, feel happy that you accomplished something. It's like an achievement in a game. Well, this game actually has achievements also for doing things, but you get the point. It's just try and then get rewarded when you finally succeed, which feels good.
Artists in games and indeed entertainment. He made Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People last year. I interviewed him in 2010, shortly before the release of Demon's Souls in Europe, and following his career has been one of the highlights of mine. I interviewed him again in Los Angeles recently, and it might comfort some to know that playing his games is sometimes torturous for him too. Leading up to the release of a game, I'll be very hands-on playing it and getting as much time on it as possible, he said. But after the release, I tend not to want...
That was interesting. My headset just cut out there for a moment. I'm gonna plug it in.
...to touch it, because I know that I'm either going to find things I left on the table or issues that will bug me. And once I become a player, I am powerless to do anything significant to change it. So once a game is out in the wild, I tend not to play it. But in preparation for Shadow of the Erdtree, I played through the main story of Elden Ring. I want to preface this by saying I absolutely suck at video games, so my approach or playstyle is to use everything at my disposal, all the assistance, every scrap of aid that the game offers, and also all the knowledge I have as the architect of the game. The freedom and open world nature of Elden Ring perhaps...
By the way, I in general don't actually even look down at people who try and use every scrap of assistance that they can in games. You know, in Dark Souls, people look down on people who use summons, which is bull, because again, we talked about this previously, but you can't use summons because that's being a noob. But then again... using completely overpowered items that are not working in the way they're supposed to, that's just fine game mechanics, people are popular. Yeah, not a great argument. I say if you can and you want, you can use anything in the game, be it something broken or whatever. Now, admittedly, I will say, if you're using some kind of cheat, exploit, something that's blatantly broken, one-shots everything or whatever in the game, yeah, I'm kind of gonna look at you like this if you say me, oh yeah, I won this game, I'm a really good player because I did it. Bitch, you cheated. There's a difference.
Lowers the barrier of entry, and I might be the one who's benefiting the most from that as a player more than anyone else. Man, I love this interview, and I think it highlights something seemingly lost in games today. How many times have you asked yourself or thought to yourself whether or not the developers actually play the games that they make? FromSoft makes challenging,
often sadly,
games. However, Miyazaki wouldn't put the player through something if he hadn't experienced it firsthand himself, to make sure that it's enjoyable, engaging, or not too impossible. Imagine Miyazaki being the worst Souls player while being the architect and visionary behind these games. Elden Ring is one of the very few games...
By the way, there's this strange notion also that people have that if you make a game, you're supposed to be the absolute best at it. That's not true. That's not even. I don't know why a lot of people see it that way. That, oh, you made the game, you must be the best at it. No, typically no one who makes the game is the best at it. That rarely happens.
Games that I can point out and say the devs have played this a lot. And there are two things that I believe proves this. Respawn Stakes of America and the lack of microtransactions. Respawning at Stakes of America save the long runbacks to optional boss encounters or wherever you last died if it's that far away from your last site of grace. It's a subtle quality of life improvement, but it's necessary in a game like Elden Ring. Why do you think it exists? Likely because Miyazaki got tired of running back to where he died over and over again. It's something that would have only been realized through experience. Why does FromSoft not?
Dude, that actually looks like a completely, well, bad fight in a certain sense. If you don't have a long enough weapon, because how are you can you okay, listen, is the solution to that mob, when it starts rolling at you, just run on the side and then it misses you anyway and you can attack at that moment? Is that how you beat it? Because if not, that's kind of really annoying.
Have microtransactions in their game, because no self-respecting player and developer would sit and play a game and think, you know what's missing here? A way to be able to rip off the players rather than reward them for actually enjoying the game. I'm sure they'd love that. Sure, they could earn this set of armor by killing this unique NPC after a hidden quest line, but I think they'd rather buy it. You know, I would actually bet good money that the vast majority of some of the best quality of life features that we've seen in games likely came from developers playing their game through the eyes of a player extensively, exhaustingly even. I realize that quality of life isn't necessarily the flashiest of video game design philosophies, but at the end of the day, it has an immeasurable effect on a player's experience while playing a game. Seriously, it's immeasurable. The vast majority of players aren't even going to notice when a quality of life feature isn't in place. Sometimes they'll call it out. They'll see another game that has something and point to the game they're playing and say, hey.
Nah, people, okay, there's a scale here, okay? There's a scale. Let's say you have a good UI and you have a mediocre-ish UI. And if you just look at them like this, the good UI is like 200 billion times better than the bad UI. But now let's say the good UI is in a really shitty game. But the bad UI, which is 100 billion times worse than the good UI, is in a pretty good game. You're never going to complain about the bad UI. Well, you're going to be like, I don't really like using this UI, but whatever. Because the overall experience is just good enough that you forget about it. This comes often in things like film critique, movie critique, and whatever. That in bad movies, you critique the plot holes, bad writing, bad characterization, bad, all of these things. But when a good movie comes and you're being scrutinous against it, you don't really care to talk about the same things. Well, you can talk about them, but you typically don't talk about them. For example, a character's motivation making absolutely no sense and being a complete dud in a good movie, you're kind of gonna almost overlook it. You're gonna say, well, the character motivation wasn't that great, but, whatever. That's gonna be your answer. But in a bad movie, because it's overall bad and it's not enjoyable, dude, when you have a character whose motivation is complete trash atrocities, you're like, this character makes no sense, completely ruins the movie, it does all of this. And what I'm saying effectively is, at the end of the day, when something is in general good, you overlook the bad things. If something is really bad, you just highlight the bad things. That's how it works.
Why isn't that here? But more times than not, they're just going to have this general feeling of unease and frustration because the game isn't providing them with conveniences that it should. Best example of this I can give is playing a survival game. The first survival game that I played that allowed me to be able to craft out of my storage rather than just only out of my personal inventory felt like a life-changing experience. Whoever was the one that designed the magic storage mod for Terraria, you're a saint. Look, it should be a requirement to play your own games. And I think the vast majority of developers that are out there do actually play their games, but I don't think that they're playing their games from the eyes.
I think a lot of them are lying about playing their own games. That's just how I think it really is.
Or from the perspective of a player. They don't have that same level of empathy that's necessary to be able to understand what players are going to do. Think about how players are actually going to experience something. More times than not, they're probably hopping in there just to test what they put in. They're working, after all. They clocked in. They're working. So they're just there to test what they're doing, make sure it works, and then move on. And it takes a really high level of leadership and wisdom to be able to hand down the idea of trying to play the game as a player rather than just constantly be testing it. And that leadership is something it's just not in this industry right now.
I think a lot of people are going to misunderstand that point, but the big difference between playing and testing is because a lot of people probably don't see the difference in that. When he talks about testing in the game industry, it's literally like this. So someone goes into the game, they either spot in the location or whatever, they use console commands or anything. They get the thing that they need to test, and they just literally test it. Does it work? There's no actually play testing. Oh, does this work when actually playing? There is a difference between playing and seeing how stuff works and just testing does stuff work. I think some people could miss this.
The interview continues. I was greatly amused by the image of Miyazaki, controller in hand, tormented by the very world he wrought and all its imperfections, which only he would notice. That's true commitment to his game design philosophy of improvement through failure, a creed that seems to permeate his whole life. Miyazaki is a hands-on director, and all his games bear an unmistakable imprint of his influence. But he has also been attempting to pass down his knowledge and artistic approach to others at From Software in the 10 years that he's been its president, ensuring that they too have the room to fail. Budgets, scale, scope, everything has grown to the point where room for failure isn't tolerated as much as I think it was in the past, he told me. FromSoft has its own way of hedging risks, so to speak, in that most of our projects have a partner who's financing the project. From a business management perspective, we're not betting everything on one single project. At the same time, you have to find the...
No one wants to bet everything on a single project. That's why Baldur's Gate 3 was such a big thing. If Baldur's Gate 3 failed, Larion would just shut down. Larion would not exist. They were forced to literally bet every single thing that they have, their jobs, their everything, on Baldur's Gate 3 to succeed.
Right project to allow for failure, whether it's smaller in scope or scale or a small module of something bigger. There has to be room for that. I think that's where a lot of young game developers will be challenged and will be able to learn from it. Making sure you understand and identify where those pockets of failure can be allowed is how we try to grow our talent. Miyazaki views Elden Ring as a turning point for From Software. Before and after Elden Ring, there is going to be a clear difference. You could see that in 2023's mech game Armored Core 6, I would say. He hopes that we will soon be seeing from other game directors at the company, not just himself. Where FromSoft is right now in terms of scale, I would say Elden Ring is really the limit. We've tapped every resource and talent we have access to, scaling it even bigger. I have my concerns, perhaps having multiple projects is the next stage, where some of the other young talent can have the opportunity to manage and direct game design for a smaller project. Man, what I love about Miyazaki's perspective here is that it goes directly against the plans and perspective of most of the AAA industry's leaders. If we take time to look around...
Yeah, they're literally giving new people a shot at actually making something, maybe small it, but at least giving them a shot. That is unheard on itself.
On the industry and look at different games that are being developed right now, we can easily point out ones and say, so what happens if that game fails? Dragon Age and EA as an example, a game that's been in development for 10 years now, going through multiple iterations, redesigns, and identity changes, something that isn't a surefire hit anymore as they've chose to reimagine what a Dragon Age game is, vaulting strategic combat and the darker themes the games used to have,
Oh, the darker themes is going to be the big one. Again, Dragon Age Railguard looks absolutely woke and broke, honestly. That you can't look at that and say, oh yeah, of course diversity, equity, and inclusion didn't play a role here.
Trying to eye a more modern audience, obviously. A dangerous gamble, to say the least, when the games that were last released by this studio were Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem. When the games industry seeks to scale itself infinitely, no wonder you have industry layoffs en masse. PlayStation, Spider-Man 2 as another example, $300 million to make, tripling the budget of Spider-Man 2018, only to sell the game to the same amount of players. The game's profits are now getting closer to the black than in the green. With all of this infinite scaling for fidelity, scope, and design, these bobblehead CEOs scale their projects and their projections the same as the game, and it's just not realistic. Knowing your limit before you reach it is an incredible act of humility on the part of FromSoft and Miyazaki. EA, Activision, Ubisoft, you know for a fact that if they had a game that was as successful as Elden Ring, they would be rushing to make the next version of it, make it bigger, spend more, and expect better results. But that's just not how games work. And I think it's something that's rarely recognized in games today. If we look around the industry and we see all the different iterations on a lot of these titles, the first, the fourth, the fifth, or the 50th when it comes to Call of Duty, it's a crapshoot whether or not you're going to be able to retain the audience that you've already had, find more, find a new audience, or even retain most of the players that you had previously.
I don't agree with this. This doesn't work in that this doesn't work like that in general, I would honestly say. Yeah, you can get a bigger audience in your second game if it's really successful and the first was highly, touted and whatnot. You can be extremely successful in your third iteration or whatever, but at some point, your game's just gonna become old. People would have played it, people would lose interest, and so on. This is what's slowly happening with all the Call of Duties, coming out every year and whatnot. People are just losing interest because they have played it. It's coming out every year. It's the same, almost, or worse, and people just lose interest. I think the first, 5 iterations of a game, if it's really, really good, can nail it and easily be done. But after that, I think, the longer it goes, the more impossible it becomes.
And you can't keep pouring money into something thinking that you're going to get the same or better results. That's a major gamble. That's what's really beautiful about the words of Miyazaki is that he says we don't bet everything on one single game, one single project, nor should you. And I think a lot of studios that are out there do, and that's one of the reasons why so many people have been losing their jobs. And what's really incredible about
I think most people obviously know that that's not a smart decision to make.
the success of Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3 is that players are going to be coming back to buy these games, not because they're looking for Baldur's Gate 4, not because they're looking for Elden Ring 2, but because they want to play a FromSoft game, because they want to play a Larian Studios game. And that's something that's been lost. There are studios that players are still doing that with today, but that used to be a lot of these industry leaders. I remember the days where I used to look up, oh man, it's an Activision game. I know that's going to be a banger. Oh, it's going to be an EA game. That's going to be a solid game. But we don't think that way anymore because these studios...
Well, yeah, because these studios have ruined everything. That's the reason why we don't think like that. Again, the longer time goes, the longer you have for a good thing turn into something bad.
Studios and these leadership of these companies has gotten so far away from the player that they don't even recognize what we look like anymore. Now, closing out the interview, Miyazaki mentioned something that's rather interesting, saying that this is the end of Elden Ring for now, but also that he wouldn't mind seeing what someone else could do with the lands between in a different medium. I don't see any reason to deny another interpretation or adaptation of Elden Ring, a movie, for example, he told me, but I don't think myself or From Software have the knowledge or ability to produce something in a different medium. So that's where a very strong partner would have to come into play.
Oh, so they're open to that. I mean, it sounded they're open to that just from this sentence alone, but yeah, ooh, that's interesting. Though, how exactly do you make an Elden Ring movie or whatever? I mean, it probably can be done relatively easy, but man, for example, I wouldn't even know where to start.
We have to build a lot of trust and agreement on whatever it is we're trying to achieve, but there's interest for sure. Now, while I love the idea of an Elden Ring TV show or movie, I think the only one that's capable of doing it justice would be Peter Jackson. I mean, basically, you're going to need something Elden Ring level to be able to compete with Elden Ring. My real takeaway is Miyazaki saying, "We are done." And FromSoft deserves to say that. Near the beginning of this video, I brought up how it requires unyielding vision to make a game as great as Elden Ring. And that relentless vision and identity of who and what From Software is as a studio and what games they aim to make is the real wake-up call for this industry. I want you to keep in mind that players and reviewers lamented about the game's difficulty at launch, and even now again with the DLC. Just recently, Bandai Namco responded to the players telling them to just go level up their Scadutree blessings. Well, sure, there's going to be some...
I mean, that's unironically the thing, yes. A lot of people are actually going into this DLC as much as I can tell, and, well, they're underleveled, they're undercooked, and they can't handle it, and they're like, oh, I'm getting one shot. That's because you're level 1.
Some day one balancing or performance issues. FromSoft doesn't run around trying to save face. They just continue to work and give the game time to breathe. Players love the feel of playing a FromSoft game because they don't resort to the now standardized practices of hand-holding that much of the industry relies on. They are going to lead you through the game by your nose. FromSoft's expectations is that you, as a player, will play the game, and they trust that you are going to have the ability to find solutions to challenges and use the tools provided on your own. There's something to be said about having faith in the players. I've said this in the past or in previous videos, but leadership is really what's lacking in most of the games industry. When I look at a game like Elden Ring, when I play a game like Elden Ring, I can feel its respect for the audience. I can feel like I'm playing a game that's made for me.
That's hard to understand what's happening.
That's a rare feeling outside of a few select releases and indie games today. Why is it so rare? Because the vast majority of the industry doesn't have the presidents and CEOs of their companies being people that worked as directors or developers of their games.
Okay, I think this is where we stop because, man, Young, yeah, for example, cries and moans and whatnot about this constantly, and it's just not true. Okay, listen. The director of EA literally doesn't even know what GTA probably is. He has never played it, he has never seen it, he has never touched it. He has no idea what that shit is. Most people at the top don't know what the game is. That's true. But that doesn't matter. Because they're not demanding that you have some kind of, fighting thing or combat related thing, or this is how the game works. No, that you cut the game into triangles and then you piece no, they do not do that. They typically don't do it like this. They just say, oh, this is gonna be a fighting game about this, and this, and you gotta make it. It is always down to the lowest denominator to make a good inventory, to make a good fighting system, to do this, to do that. No big wig up top is actually opening an inventory evidence saying, oh yeah, this looks good. Now, there are game directors that oversee all of this, but they actually do look at the game and whatnot. They even kind of play the game most of the time, but the people up top don't. But the people up top are not responsible for combat being bad, for items being bad, for any of the actual in-game problems the game has. They're responsible for adding microtransactions to the game, and that's pretty much it. Anyway, I think we are absolutely done here. Legendary drops, everyone. 10 out of 10. Bye.